He is not just a man. He's not just a Superman. He is the prophet of the Lord!
The Last Dragonborn, also known as John or Jane Skyrim, is the protagonist of Skyrim, the saviour of the world, the slayer of vampires, and the superior Dragonborn, because all of that aura farming did Marak no favours. By the end of the game, the Last Dragonborn has a claim to be the most powerful mortal in all of Tamriel, depending on your opinion of the Nerevarine and where exactly he is. They are essentially a walking nuclear bomb, able to summon storms, dragons, and unrelenting forces that cast chickens into the sky. Their very existence, and power, change the entire dynamic of the Aldmeri Dominion and Empire conflict, as they're on the Thalmor's hit list. And yet their fate is probably going to be underwhelming at best. We don't know what exactly it will be, because we're still waiting on the Elder Scrolls 6, but there are theories. So let's have a look at some here, and which are the most likely based on what we know about other Scrolls protagonists. So strap in for my best MatPat impression, because we're looking at more Scrolls theories.
Dov Walan Farel. We were made to dominate. The will to power is in our blood. You feel it in yourself, do you not?
So, before we look at some theories, I think it's important to get some criteria out of the way. For one, we don't yet know where on the timeline Elder Scrolls 6 will sit. For reference, ES 1 to 4 take place under the rule of one emperor, Uriel Septim VII. Well, Oblivion does for about 5 minutes. The intro of the game is literally Uriel getting the Caesar treatment, but Arena starts in year 389 of the Third Era, while Oblivion starts in 433 of that same era, meaning a 44-year gap. Skyrim takes place 200 years after Oblivion ends, which is the first time there's been such a significant gap between two mainline games in the series. Thus the question becomes, how long after Skyrim will the Elder Scrolls 6 take place? It could be a few years, similarly to how Oblivion was only 6-ish years after Morrowind, or hundreds as we've already established between Skyrim and Oblivion. I believe it's more likely to be a few years, given the whole Aldmeri Dominion and threat of a Second Great War thing established in Skyrim. Oblivion felt like the end of something big, with the Septim dynasty being wiped out, but Skyrim feels like the start of a new era with the rise of the Thalmor. To me anyway, it feels like Bethesda are more likely to stay in this rough time period, and thus this is the mindset I will have for most of the video. Another reason is that, unless John Skyrim does something massive, like start his own empire, it probably doesn't matter what happens to him after the game if there's such a long gap in time. He could just live out a normal life, then keel over from old age. Also, John here should be able to die of old age. From my understanding, the only reason Marak lived as long as he did was that he was a dragon priest, so John Skyrim will eventually croak from Father Time. On that note, we're also going to work with the generic Nord John Skyrim. An elven dragonborn could theoretically live for ages, but that isn't the guy we have on all the promotional art, although this won't factor in too much. Finally, we have to figure out the scale of the ending that the Last Dragonborn could get. Essentially, how much will their specific actions echo in the rest of the game, and how much will we see them specifically get mentioned in the Elder Scrolls 6. And for that, we need to look at some examples.
Bring me a champion! Rend the flesh of my foes! A mortal champion to wade through the entrails of my enemies.
The easiest examples are the hero of Kvatch and the Nerevarine, but put a pin on those two for now, because having a look at Arena and Daggerfall's protagonists will also illustrate a point. You see, I have no idea what happened with the Eternal Hero, that's Arena's protagonist, or the Agent, the dude in Daggerfall. Like, none whatsoever. These two are practically Uriel Septim's employees, and while the Eternal Hero became a cultural icon, his identity was kept a secret. According to a paragraph in the Arena game guide, his forename might have been Talon. And he was a guy, but other than that I've not really got anything. Now given the time between Arena and Oblivion, if he's human, he could potentially be too old to make much of an impact by the time of Oblivion, or could have just quietly died, because again, his identity was kept a secret, and thus wasn't there for Uriel when he bites the bullet, or I guess the Mythic Dawn dagger. The Agent basically goes off the grid from what we can tell, and while it says the blades lost contact with the Agent, a dragon break called the Warp to the West essentially means all endings of the game are true simultaneously, I think, so the Agent could really be anywhere. For context, dragon breaks are essentially breaks in time, and when these happen, simultaneous timelines can coexist, and will eventually reform into a singular linear timeline. But when the dragon break ends and time reunifies, all of those simultaneous timelines can be true at once. Now that might sound complicated, but realistically dragon breaks exist so that Bethesda don't have to retcon anything, they can just say a bunch of things are true at once and move on with their lives. Now I did see a theory that he becomes Archmage Trebonius in Morrowind, but all you've really got to know from the Agent and the Eternal Champion is that Bethesda wrote them out of the picture for the next game. Again, because these games take place relatively soon after one another, especially compared to the gap between Oblivion and Skyrim, these now extremely overpowered characters can't be around for the next title, especially if they work for the same guy, and especially in the Eternal Champion's case because he went all around Tamriel. Then that leads us to the Nerevarine and the hero of Kvatch. For context, the Nerevarine is stupidly powerful and was, by far, the most powerful mortal in Tamriel, quite possibly the world, when Morrowind ended. He was a godslayer, functionally immortal, and there have been many a discussion about who is more powerful, him or John Skyrim, as far as mortals go. Now granted, the Nerevarine might be technically a type of god. In either video on godhood, focused on Talos specifically, if you want to have a look at that. But the fact that he and John Skyrim are even comparable is quite astonishing. It should be no surprise then that the Nerevarine was written out of the Oblivion Crisis to make the crisis, well, more of a crisis. And according to NPC dialogue, he left on an expedition to Akavir, another continent where we get all the Weeaboo stuff from. Whether that's still the case hundreds of years later by the time of Skyrim is unknown, but as I said before, the Nerevarine is functionally immortal, so he's probably still kicking around somewhere on Nirn. The main thing is that he's out of the picture and probably not in Tamriel. Then there's the hero of Kvatch, who does appear in Skyrim very technically and slightly theoretically. During the Shivering Isles DLC, the hero of Kvatch stops the Grey March and becomes the next Sheogorath by defeating Jiggalag. Jiggalag goes, somewhere. So theoretically, with the hero of Kvatch being the new Lord of Madness, the Sheogorath we meet in Skyrim during the Wabbajack quest is him. Still, his quest is self-contained, and he doesn't have much of a bearing on Skyrim the game itself. He's also fully Sheogorath at this point, and if the body is from the hero of Kvatch, there probably isn't much of his mind left. All this is to say that the previous protagonists are written out in a way to basically sideline them and ensure they cannot interfere with the events of the next title, because their feats and power suggest that they could potentially stop the rising threat to come, or at least put Bethesda in a situation where they have to write more lore for a character that the players were meant to dictate the lives of. With that in mind, let's have a look at the first of these theories, one very much in line with what happened with the hero of Kvatch.
I have found a new Dragonborn to serve me.
Much like the Shivering Isles DLC, the Dragonborn expansion for Skyrim involves a lot of time with the Daedric Prince, Hermaeus Mora, and in their realm of Apocrypha. If you want to know more about Tentacles McGee, I have a video about him here, but it seems that Bethesda has already given itself a way out. Mora famously has a Dragonborn imprisoned in Apocrypha, Murak, and after he's about to get out, we step in to slap him silly, but Squid Game here will want a replacement, even telling Murak in his final moments that he has a new Dragonborn to serve him, being us, obviously. Now, he does let us roam around after the DLC ends, similarly to how the new Lord Sheogorath can spend his days in Cyrodiil, but we are warned by Freya about not relying on more of Hermaeus Mora's knowledge, yet there are the remaining Black Books, so that could be the Last Dragonborn's fate. After the Dragonborn DLC ends, maybe we end up in the tentacle clutches of Mora after the game ends, taking Murak's place as the mass of eyeballs intended. Thus, when the threat of the Elder Scrolls 6 occurs, the Last Dragonborn can't do anything about it because he's chilling in the Cypher's Midden as Hermaeus Mora's trophy prisoner. Of course, there are arguments against this, such as Hermaeus Mora allowing John Skyrim to roam Tamriel following Murak's defeat, so it could be that the Daedric Prince would rather us acting as a mobile agent in a way, perhaps unwittingly. Still, this is probably Bethesda's best option if they ever chose one. It makes sense in the lore, given how Mora can keep even Daedric princes imprisoned. But, and this is a big but, this is assuming that Bethesda even cares enough to give us some information or an explanation. There's probably no way for us to know if this is the case in Elder Scrolls 6, if this is actually the fate of the Last Dragonborn, unless Mora starts bragging about it, I guess. But the Calamari King prefers to keep things secret most of the time, so let's have a look at a potential option inspired by the Nerevarine. So, what if the Dragonborn is allowed to roam free by Hermaeus Mora and seeks to go out of Tamriel for any number of reasons? He could directly follow the Nerevarine and go to the continent of Akavir, given that he's Dragonborn. The people of Akavir are known to hold the Dragonborn in high regard, even a figure to be worshipped, given that they allegedly laid down their arms and began to fight for Remen Cyrodiil, a Dragonborn emperor, proclaiming him to be the one that they've spent their lives seeking. After learning about him in Skyhaven Temple, somewhere we have to go in the main quest, and suffering from the boredom of doing everything, like what the Ebony Warrior goes on about, perhaps John Skyrim will seek to learn more about what it means to be a Dragonborn on alien shores, especially because of the polarising opinions of both Delphine's Blades and the Greybeards. If Ryan Morrowind could do it, I don't see why the Dragonborn couldn't. A ship is of course one option, many in Tamriel have sailed to and fro Akavir, but maybe asking Odahviing for a lift is another. Or you could just bend wheel the nearest dragon, either way Dover Airlines is definitely an option. Still, as much as recycling is good for the environment, it's not always as good a narrative tool, but Akavir isn't the only continent option for John or Jane Skyrim. Instead, they could seek to learn more about Hermaeus Mora and his relationship with Nords by travelling to the original homeland of the Nords, at Mora. It was here that Hermaeus Mora was called the Woodland Man, and was known to trick Ysgramor, yet Ysgramor managed to escape the Calamari King's clutches on several occasions, given that we see him in Sovngarde. So, in an effort to do the same, the Last Dragonborn goes on an expedition to Atmora to learn more. Now, granted, you don't necessarily need this reason, or any reason at all, to have the Last Dragonborn go to Atmora. I can't really think of a reason as to why the Nerevarine would go to Akavir other than, well, he had nothing else better to do, I guess. and John Skyrim could just want to learn more about the past of the land he defended by visiting the continent of the Nord's ancestors. Perhaps Serana joins him? She doesn't really seem to be bothered by the cold, and that would write her out of the Elder Scrolls 6 too. Although a bit of me feels like she might be a returning character for the Elder Scrolls 6, given her popularity in the game. It's not like we don't get returning characters who aren't gods. Uriel Septim appeared in minigames, and there's also Neloth and Maik the Liar. Hell, the Adoring Fan managed to cross universes, so, you know, anything's possible really. Another reasonable option is that the Last Dragonborn, after realising that Alduin probably isn't truly gone, since we don't dine on his soul like every other dragon, and Dragonborn, either prepares for Alduin's re-emergence, or hunts down what's left of the World Eater. Alduin always ends a Kalpa, that's what a cycle of the world is called, and we're pretty sure it happened several times before, since almost all cultures in Tamriel, and even some beyond it, have tales about a past Kalpa. Paarthurnax knows about it too, and refers to a Kalpa as the egg of the next world, and while he never says the word Kalpa, he references this a few times, talking about the next world when having many a discussion about Alduin. And he believes that once the World Eater's defeated, it's enough to stop the end of the world, at least temporarily. Still, because we don't eat his soul, and because it's very clear that John or Jane Skyrim feels strongly about defeating Alduin, something we don't really get a say in, perhaps the Last Dragonborn makes it their mission to either hunt down Alduin's recovering essence to put an end to him for good, or otherwise preserves themselves to be ready for when Alduin returns, thus taking them out of the Elder Scrolls 6. A Serana-style eternal nap is always an option, if we get a bit of vampire blood too, or perhaps we work with Odahviing Paarthurnax, or whoever else, to become immortal, in the Dragon Priest way, and lock ourselves in a sarcophagus ready to face Alduin when the end of the world happens. This could also lead to John Skyrim working with Hermaeus Mora to see this through, or travel to Atmora, the origin of the dragon cult, for answers, feeding into my first and second theories. Long story short, what really matters is that the Last Dragonborn doesn't have too much of a presence after Skyrim ends. The real answer could be whatever works for your Dragonborn, provided it isn't too grand, and that's why we have to dismiss a popular idea that the Last Dragonborn could become the next Emperor.
Let me see your face. You are the one from my dreams. Then the stars were right. And this is the day.
Theoretically, the Last Dragonborn becoming the Emperor is entirely possible. Emperors have typically been Dragonborns up until Martin Septim, with the exception of the odd potentate, and when it comes to Cyrodiilic empires, that's their entire claim to fame, with undeniable proof that we are in fact Dragonborn, and with Titus Mede II dead, without us knowing about any heirs, perhaps John Skyrim could become Emperor John Skyrim to keep the Empire from falling into the hands of the Aldmeri Dominion, but I don't think Bethesda will take this path. Remember, we don't know about Titus Mede's heirs, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have any. His cousin, Victoria Vici, didn't seem anywhere near the crown, and that makes me believe there are quite a few people in front of her in line for the throne. I think the Mede lineage is secure enough, especially given how calm Titus was when facing his death. And, of course, having the Dragonborn become an emperor, especially if the Elder Scrolls 6 is to take place soon after Skyrim, as I believe, isn't exactly writing them out of the picture. The Emperors have had quite an impact on every main Elder Scrolls game. Uriel Septim was captured in Arena, sent the Agent and the Reverin to Daggerfall and Morrowind, and was assassinated in Oblivion, and Titus Mede's White Gold Concordat caused a civil war in Skyrim, plus he gets the Dark Brotherhood treatment. This seems very against Bethesda's track record thus far, and it would also mean having an important historical figure who establishes a lineage be a roleplay character with a past that could be literally anything depending on what the player wants. It just gets too tricky, unless Bethesda plans to go another few hundred years in the future for Elder Scrolls 6, which is entirely possible. Ultimately, the most likely option is that the Last Dragonborn probably won't get much of an explanation from Bethesda, and what happens to them will be up for interpretation. It's the safest option. Just don't mention the Dragonborn in the Elder Scrolls 6. This way the audience can make their own story. The audience hasn't spent this long with an Elder Scrolls protagonist without a successor before, so there's likely more emotional investment behind John Skyrim, especially because Skyrim is the most popular of the Elder Scrolls games. This is also assuming that Bethesda don't do something different, and set the Elder Scrolls 6 at the same time as Skyrim, since the Iliac Bay is looking like the most likely option. And by the time of Skyrim, Hammerfell isn't in the Empire, so things could be very, very different. If I were to choose my favourite option, it would be that the Last Dragonborn goes on an expedition north, to Atmora, just because I like the idea of Atmora. If I were to choose the most likely option, it will be the Hermaeus Mora route. Hermaeus Mora can write people out of history, and this way, the Last Dragonborn could have been anything at all. Done anything, and Hermaeus Mora could alter the history so everything that happened in Skyrim could have been canon. Plus, you can have Easter eggs about the Last Dragonborn's whereabouts through Hermaeus Mora's Daedric quest or little hints here and there. Of course, that's assuming Bethesda even choose one option. They could have an NPC say there's a rumour that John Skyrim left Windhelm on an expedition to Atmora, have another say that they saw a fire-breathing man emerge from a book, writhed in tentacles, and a third say that the Dragonborn is now retired and just can't be bothered anymore. Rumours are rumours after all, and it doesn't have to be true. It's not like Bethesda has to be definitive about the Last Dragonborn's fate. Todd and crew weren't all that definitive about any other Elder Scrolls protagonist, but I feel like if you could force an answer out of him, assuming that's even possible because, you know, God Howard, he would probably say John Skyrim stuck with the Calamari King. That'd be my bet anyway.
Oh my god, why do you talk so slow?
When you say that, what I feel is
man,
that you're trying
Tina,
to...
this is really, really boring.
Thanks for watching, and hopefully you enjoyed a bit of a double upload this week. And it finally feels like hell is freezing over. You might think that's an exaggeration from me, but 30 degrees in the UK is not 30 degrees anywhere else in the world. I can't explain it. The country itself is just built terribly for the heat. Anyway, enough about the UK. What I want to know from you guys is what the future beyond Skyrim holds for your Dragonborn. This doesn't have to be what you think will happen to the Last Dragonborn in general, just what your specific Dragonborn has planned post Merak and Alduin. Now this will give you a specific reason to do the whole usual ritual of liking, commenting and subscribing, and don't worry, normal service of Elder Scrolls lore is continuing next week, no more Bethesda nonsense and no more theories, at least for a little bit. Hopefully I'll see you then.